The sound of the lock turning was a sharp, metal intrusion into the 2 a.m. silence. I froze, my hand hovering over a stack of red-inked invoices, the air around me thick with the smell of burnt coffee and the hum of a laptop struggling to render a prototype I couldn't afford to manufacture. The door swung open, and the hallway light spilled in, illuminating the last person I expected to see, breaking into my life. Elena. She stood there, dripping wet, clutching a designer leather bag like it contained state secrets. "My ceiling just collapsed," she said, her voice trembling, "and I have nowhere else to go." To understand the gravity of her standing on my fraying rug, you have to understand the architecture of our building's hierarchy. Elena was the marble saint, a renowned architect who designed museums that looked like glaciers and private residences that cost more than my company's entire valuation. She moved through the lobby with a terrifying, silent grace. I was the chaotic element on the fourth floor, the founder of a failing hardware startup living in a unit that doubled as a workshop and a panic room. I had given her the spare key 6 months ago during a 5-second interaction at the mailboxes, a gesture of neighborly safety I never expected her to cash in. "Keep it for emergencies," I'd said, trying not to stare at the precise line of her jaw. She had taken it with a gloved hand, nodded once, and vanished into the elevator. Now that key was in her hand, wet with rain, and she was dismantling my solitude. "Come in," I managed, standing up. My knees cracked, a protest against the 12 hours I'd spent in my ergonomic nightmare of a chair. "You're soaking." She stepped inside, and the atmosphere in the room shifted instantly. My apartment usually smelled of solder and anxiety. Suddenly, it smelled of ozone, expensive rain, and her, a warm scent of sandalwood that cut through the stale air. She looked around, her eyes scanning the chaos of my living room. It was a war zone of circuit boards, coffee cups, and whiteboard sketches taped to the walls. Her gaze was clinical, dissecting the disorder. "The pipe in the unit above mine burst," she explained, unbuttoning her coat with fingers that looked stiff from cold. "The water destroyed the master suite. The contractor said it's uninhabitable for at least 3 days. There's a hotel on 5th, I suggested, moving a stack of motherboards off the only armchair I owned. "I can call you a car." "I can't do hotels," she cut in, her voice sharp. She walked further into the room, avoiding a stray coil of wire on the floor. "The geometry is wrong. The lighting is artificial. It feels transient. I have a deadline, a final submission for the Tokyo project. I need familiar architecture. I need to be in this building." She looked at me then, really looked at me, and I felt the weight of her attention. It was heavy, like she was calculating the load-bearing capacity of my patience. "You said it was for emergencies," she reminded me, her tone softer now, almost vulnerable. "I did," I admitted. "But I didn't think the emergency would involve you standing in my kitchen looking like a drowned masterpiece." A ghost of a smile touched her lips, then vanished. She gestured to the corner of the room where I had shoved my sofa to make room for a soldering station. "That layout is inefficient," she noted, walking over to inspect the furniture. "You're blocking the natural light flow. It creates stagnant energy." "I'm not feng shuiing, Elena. I'm trying to build a prototype before I run out of cash," I shot back, though the bite was gone from my voice. She turned to face me, the wet silk of her blouse clinging to her shoulders. Up close, the marble saint looked human. Her mascara was smudged slightly at the corner of one eye. Her hands were shaking, not from cold, but from adrenaline. "My apartment is uninhabitable," she whispered, a confession that felt too intimate for the open space between us. "But I can't go anywhere else. Can I stay?" The request hung in the air, charged and heavy. I looked at her, this woman who usually looked through me in the elevator, now asking for sanctuary in the wreckage of my life. "The couch is lumpy," I warned, crossing my arms to keep from reaching out to take her coat, "and I drink terrible coffee." "I'll survive the coffee," she said, finally dropping the heavy bag onto the floor. "Just don't move the furniture while I'm sleeping. I might reorganize it in my dreams." I watched her settle onto the edge of the sofa, her posture rigid, trying to maintain her architectural lines in my messy world. The rain lashed against the window, sealing us in. The distance between the fourth floor and the penthouse had just collapsed, and as I looked at her, I realized the real danger wasn't the flood upstairs. It was the sudden, terrifying proximity of a woman I had spent months admiring from afar, now breathing the same stale air as me. Morning arrived not with the gentle intrusion of sunlight, but with the distinct, scratching rhythm of a pencil moving across heavy paper. I dragged myself out of the bedroom, my eyes gritty with sleep and my mind already racing through the day's potential disasters, only to find that my apartment had been annexed. My kitchen island, previously a topographical map of financial ruin, covered in unpaid invoices and half-soldered circuit boards, had been transformed. Elena had pushed my chaos to the far left edge, corralling my entire business into a precarious 12-inch stack. In its place, she had unrolled a massive sheet of architectural vellum pinned down at the corners by my salt shaker, and a bottle of expensive sparkling water she must have pulled from her bag. She was standing there, leaning over the paper with a focus that was almost terrifying, sketching lines so straight they looked machine-made. She was wearing a silk robe that looked like liquid silver, something that probably cost more than my car, and she hadn't even noticed I was in the room. Or maybe she had, and I just didn't register as a variable worth acknowledging yet. You moved my burn rate projections, I said, my voice rough with sleep. I aligned them, she corrected, not looking up. Her hand moved with a fluid, practiced grace. They were creating visual noise. It was impossible to think. I walked toward the coffee machine, which required navigating the narrow, demilitarized zone of the galley kitchen. This space was designed for one person who ate takeout over the sink, not for two women circling each other like wary predators. I had to squeeze behind her to get to the grinder. The distance between us evaporated. I could feel the heat radiating from her back, smell that faint trace of sandalwood and rain. She didn't move an inch to accommodate me. She just held her breath, a tiny, sharp intake of air that told me she was hyper-aware of exactly where my body was in relation to hers. I need coffee, I announced, reaching for the bag of dark roast. I made tea, she countered, finally lifting the pencil. She gestured to a teapot she must have found in the back of a cupboard I hadn't opened in years. Jasmine pearls. The caffeine spike from your coffee is erratic. It creates a frantic energy in the room. I need steady waves. I don't run on steady waves, Elena. I run on panic and sludge. I ground the beans anyway. The noise was aggressive, a mechanical scream that filled the small space. She winced, her shoulders tightening under the silk, but she didn't leave. We stood there in the aftermath of the noise, waiting for the water to boil. The silence that followed was heavy, thick with the things we weren't saying. I leaned against the counter, clutching my mug like a shield, and looked at the island. The contrast was devastating. On her side, the clean, elegant lines of a museum lobby taking shape in graphite. On my side, the red ink of final notices and the jagged sketches of a prototype that kept failing. It looks peaceful, I admitted, gesturing to her drawing. It's structural, she said, taking a sip of her tea. Her eyes flicked to my stack of papers, then to my face. The clinical assessment was back. Your business model lacks a foundation. You're building the roof before you've poured the concrete. I'm pivoting, I defended, feeling exposed in my oversized t-shirt. It's agile. It's messy, she said softly. She turned back to her work, but the flow was gone. I watched her hand hover over the paper. She hesitated. The pencil didn't touch the surface. The tension in the room had shifted from architectural to atmospheric. The entropy in here. It's loud, she murmured, setting the pencil down with a sharp click. Even when you're quiet, your stress is vibrating at a frequency that disrupts the line. I can go to the office, I offered, though my office was just a darker corner of the room. No, she said, turning to face me. The distance in the galley kitchen closed again. Her eyes were dark, tired, and searching. I don't want to be alone in here. The silence in my own apartment is usually perfect, but right now, I need the noise. I just need it to be organized noise. She looked at me, and for a second, the marble saint cracked. She looked less like an award-winning architect and more like a woman who was terrified of the quiet. We can't work here, I decided, setting my mug down. The air was too charged, the proximity too distracting. If we stayed in this kitchen, with her in that silk robe and me with my defenses down, something was going to break, and I couldn't afford for it to be me. There's a cafe around the corner, neutral ground, bad lighting, but excellent tables. She considered it, running the calculation. Acceptable, she said, as long as they don't play jazz. The cafe was called The Daily, a name as uninspired as the decor, but it was neutral territory. It was a place of worn wood, exposed brick, and the aggressive hiss of an espresso machine that hadn't been serviced since the mid-2000s. It was my second home, a place where I could hide in the ambient noise. For Elena, it was clearly a sensory assault. She stood in the doorway for a moment, clutching her bag, looking like a piece of modern art that had been curated into a garage sale. She surveyed the scuffed floors, the mismatched chairs, and the barista with the green hair who was currently shouting an order. I saw her jaw tighten, a micro-expression of distaste that she quickly smoothed over into a mask of polite endurance. The acoustics are terrible, she noted as we threaded our way through the crowd. The sound bounces off the brick. It creates a chaotic reverb. It's white noise, I said, claiming a small, wobbly bistro table in the back corner. It drowns out the panic. She sat down opposite me, wiping the table with a napkin before she allowed her elbows to touch the surface. The table was impossibly small, a round disc of faux marble that forced us into an intimacy we had just tried to escape. To fit, we had to interlock our legs slightly, a geometric necessity that felt like a tactical error the moment we sat down. I opened my laptop, the screen glowing with the pitch deck I had been agonizing over for weeks. Elena ordered a black tea, specifying the temperature of the water with a precision that made the barista blink, and then sat back, watching me work. "You're squinting," she observed after 5 minutes of silence. "I'm thinking," I corrected, typing a sentence and then immediately deleting it. "You're hesitating," she countered. "You type 3 words, pause for 2 seconds, then backspace. You don't believe in the sentence." I stopped typing and looked at her. "It's a value proposition, Elena. It's not a blueprint. It has to be fluid. Fluidity without a container is just a spill," she said, her voice cool. "You treat structure like it's a prison. It's not. It's a skeleton. Without it, your beautiful idea is just a pile of meat on the floor." I opened my mouth to argue, to tell her she didn't understand the agility of a startup, but I shifted in my chair, and under the table, my knee brushed against hers. It was an accident. The table was too small. The space was too tight. But the contact wasn't a brush. It was a collision of 2 different worlds. Her leg was warm, solid, clad in expensive wool trousers. Mine was shaking slightly with caffeine jitters and worn denim. Neither of us moved. The contact lingered. 1 second. 2. 3. The noise of the cafe, the grinding beans, the chatter, the indie folk music seemed to drop away, leaving us suspended in a vacuum of sudden, sharp awareness. I could feel the heat of her skin through the layers of fabric. It was a grounding wire. The frantic energy that usually buzzed under my skin quieted, drawn out by the sheer, immovable weight of her presence. She didn't pull away. She held my gaze, her eyes dark and unreadable, and for the first time I saw the marble saint not as a statue, but as a woman who was just as aware of the voltage between us as I was. "Your knee," I whispered, my voice sounding too loud in my own ears. "Inefficient furniture," she murmured, but she didn't shift her leg. "The ergonomics are hostile." "Elena," I said, the name feeling heavy on my tongue. She broke the contact first, pulling back with a sudden, sharp movement, reaching for my laptop. She spun it around to face her, breaking the spell with a return to professional distance. "Show me," she commanded. I watched her read. She didn't skim. She dissected. Her eyes moved across my slides with the same cold precision she used to inspect a foundation. She frowned at my revenue projections. She tapped a manicured fingernail against my mission statement. "Here," she said, pointing to slide 4. "This is structural failure." "That's my growth strategy," I protested. It's a cantilever with no support, she said, pulling a silver pen from her bag. She didn't ask permission. She just started drawing on a paper napkin. You're trying to scale vertically before you've established a base. Look, if you pivot here, she drew a sharp, clean line, and anchor the user base here, the tension holds. Right now, you're building a tower of cards in a wind tunnel. I looked at the napkin. In 3 lines, she had solved a logistics problem I had been fighting for a month. It wasn't a critique, it was a rescue. You understand the business? I asked, stunned. I understand weight distribution, she said simply, capping her pen. Money, gravity, emotion. It all follows the same laws. If you don't balance the load, it breaks. She slid the napkin across the table. Our fingers brushed again. Light this time. Fleeting. But the spark was still there. Thank you, I said, taking the napkin like it was a sacred text. Don't thank me, she said, standing up and buttoning her coat. Just fix the slide. I can't sleep in an apartment where the business strategy is structurally unsound. It makes me anxious. The walk back to the building was different. The rain had stopped, leaving the streets slick and black, reflecting the city lights. We walked side by side, the silence between us no longer empty. It was charged, heavy with the unsaid. She had seen my mess and hadn't turned away. She had tried to fix it, and I had felt the heat of her leg against mine and hadn't wanted to move. We were no longer just neighbors. We were co-conspirators in a small, dangerous architecture of our own making. Tuesday morning arrived with the subtlety of a demolition crew. This was the day. The pitch. The meeting that would decide if my company kept the lights on or if I'd be selling my soldering iron on eBay by Friday. I was standing in front of the hallway mirror, frantically trying to steam a wrinkle out of my blazer with a travel iron when Elena appeared in the doorway. She was dressed in a charcoal suit that was tailored so sharply it could probably cut glass, holding a set of car keys that looked heavy enough to be a weapon. You're taking the subway, she stated. It wasn't a question. It was an accusation. It's the 4 train, Elena. It's direct. It's a variable, she corrected, walking past me to inspect my shoes. Delays, crowds, humidity. You'll arrive with your cortisol spiked and your presentation compromised. Variables introduce failure points. I'm driving you. I didn't argue. I didn't have the energy to fight a woman who treated commute logistics like a military operation. Her car was exactly what I expected. A sleek, black sedan that smelled of new money and old leather. The kind of vehicle that insulated you from the world so completely that the city outside looked like a silent film. She drove with terrifying precision, navigating the morning traffic with the same cool detachment she applied to everything else. She didn't turn on the radio. She didn't make small talk. She just delivered me to the client's office tower in Midtown with 5 minutes to spare, her hands relaxed on the wheel while I vibrated with nerves in the passenger seat. Wait here, I said, unbuckling. I'll be an hour. I'll wait inside, she said, cutting the engine. The idling vibration is annoying. The client's office was a monument to transparency. Glass walls, polished concrete, and an open-plan layout designed to make everyone feel exposed. I left Elena in the lobby, seated on a low-slung modernist sofa that she probably critiqued the moment her weight hit the cushion. She opened an architectural digest, crossing her legs, looking like she owned the building. I walked into the conference room. 3 partners sat there, men who had made their fortunes betting on desperation. They looked at me, expecting the girl with the lumpy couch and the failing prototype. But as I plugged in my laptop, I felt a shift. I wasn't just the broke neighbor anymore. I was the person who had survived the invasion of the Marble Saint. The pitch began. I spoke, and my voice didn't shake. I laid out the strategy, the one Elena had sketched on a napkin, and I saw them lean in. I moved around the room, commanding the space, using my hands to carve out the future I was building. Halfway through the financials, I turned to point at the screen, and my line of sight cut through the glass wall of the conference room, straight out to the lobby. Elena wasn't reading. The magazine was closed on her lap. She was watching me. Her gaze was intense, unblinking. Usually, when she looked at me, it was with that clinical, dissecting stare, searching for flaws in my furniture arrangement or my coffee habits. But this was different. She was watching me command a room of powerful men, and her expression wasn't critical. It was focused. It was the way she looked at a building that had just surprised her with its resilience. She was studying the way I handled the questions, the way I pivoted the objections, the way I held the room's gravity in my hands. For a second, our eyes locked through the layers of glass. She didn't look away. She nodded, a microscopic tilt of her chin. Continue. It was a shot of adrenaline straight to the chest. I turned back to the partners and closed the deal with a ferocity that surprised even me. The ride home was quiet, but the atmosphere in the car had changed. It was no longer the silence of a driver and a passenger. It was the heavy, charged silence of two equals, sitting in the aftermath of a victory. The city blurred past, gray and indifferent, but inside the leather cocoon, the air was thick. I loosened my blazer. Letting out a breath I felt like I'd been holding for 3 hours. They liked the pivot, I said, staring out the window. They want to see the beta next week. I know, Elena said, her eyes on the road. I saw their body language. The one on the left stopped checking his watch after 4 minutes. You had them. You were watching? I was assessing, she corrected, merging lanes with a fluid motion. You're different in the field. At home, you're porous. You let the chaos in, but in there, you were solid. She paused at a red light and turned to look at me. The dashboard lights cast shadows across her face, softening the sharp angles of her cheekbones. I underestimated your structural integrity, she admitted quietly. I thought you were held together by luck and caffeine, but you have a steel core. It's impressive. The compliment landed heavier than any insult she could have thrown, coming from her, a woman who measured the world in stress loads and failure points. It felt like a knighthood. I have to be, I said, meeting her gaze. I don't have a safety net, Elena. If I crack, the whole thing comes down. Then don't crack, she said, the light turning green. She pressed the accelerator and the car surged forward. Because I'm starting to realize that I don't want to see you fall. We didn't speak for the rest of the drive, but the space between us felt smaller. When we walked back into my apartment, the familiar smell of solder and stale air hit us, but it felt different now. The room felt too small for who we were becoming. It wasn't just a workspace anymore. It was a cage we were both pacing in, circling each other, waiting for the next wall to come down. It was 3 a.m. when the truce finally broke. I'd woken up for a glass of water, moving quietly through the dark hallway, only to find the living room bathed in the harsh, blue light of a tablet screen. Elena wasn't asleep. She was contorted on my sofa, a piece of furniture I'd bought from a grad student in 2015, which possessed the structural integrity of a marshmallow. She was sitting up, pressing the heel of her hand into her lower back, her face a mask of silent, white-knuckled agony. The marble saint looked like she was crumbling. Her posture, usually a vertical line of perfect tension, was compromised. She shifted, trying to find a surface that didn't sag, and let out a breath that sounded suspiciously like a whimper. You're in pain, I said, my voice startling her. She snapped upright, or tried to, before wincing and freezing in place. I am merely adjusting, she lied, though her voice was tight. The ergonomics of this sofa are hostile. The lumbar support is non-existent. It's compressing my spinal column. It's a couch, Elena, not a Herman Miller chair. It's designed for napping, not for 3 nights of restorative sleep. I walked over, looking at the way she was holding herself. It wasn't just discomfort. It was damage. You can't sleep here again. You have a presentation on Thursday. If you walk into that meeting hunched over like you're carrying the weight of the world, they'll smell blood. I am fine, she insisted, reaching for her tablet. I just need to find a position that aligns the vertebrae. Take the bed, I said. The offer hung there, heavy and dangerous in the quiet room. I'm serious. I can sleep on the couch. My back is already ruined from years of soldering on the floor. You need the mattress. Absolutely not, she shot back, the refusal instant and sharp. I am not displacing you in your own home. That violates the guest-host protocol. It creates a debt I cannot repay with a simple thank you. I will not be the reason you wake up compromised. So what's the alternative? I asked, crossing my arms. We keep doing this? You breaking your back to be polite? And me watching you slowly disintegrate? That's inefficient, Elena, and I know how much you hate inefficiency. She looked at the couch, then at the dark doorway to my bedroom, and finally at me. She was running the risk assessment. I could see the variables tumbling behind her eyes. Pain versus propriety. Sleep versus protocol. The bed, she said slowly, is a king, correct? It's a queen, but it runs large, I corrected. Width of 60 inches, she calculated, her voice dropping to that problem-solving murmur. 2 adult humans require approximately 24 inches of lateral space to sleep without contact. That leaves a 12-inch buffer zone, a demilitarized zone. She looked up at me, her expression unreadable in the shadows. We are 2 professional women. We are capable of understanding spatial boundaries. We can share the resource. Share, I repeated, the word feeling dry in my throat. It is the only logical solution, she stated, standing up and gathering her silk robe around her like armor. Unless you prefer the couch. No, I admitted. I hate the couch. Then we execute the compromise. The process of getting into bed with the woman who designed the city's most intimidating skyline was a diplomatic exercise in avoidance. We treated the mattress like a chessboard. She took the left side, the side nearest the window. I took the right, clinging to the edge like it was a cliff. We constructed the wall immediately, a barrier of throw pillows and a rolled-up duvet down the absolute center of the bed. It was ridiculous. It was necessary. Good night, she said, her voice crisp, turning her back to me instantly. Night, I replied, staring at the ceiling. I turned off the lamp, plunging the room into a darkness that felt far more intimate than the cafe or the car. Visuals were gone, which meant the other senses took over with terrifying clarity. The silence of the apartment, usually a void I tried to fill with podcasts, was now alive. I could hear the rhythm of her breathing, slow, deliberate, trying to force sleep. I could smell her, that sandalwood and rain scent, no longer competing with the stale coffee of the kitchen, but here, in the sheets, surrounding me. But it was the heat that was the problem. Even with the pillow wall between us, I could feel the warmth radiating from her body. It drifted across the 12-inch gap, a ghost of a touch. It was a physical reminder that the marble saint wasn't made of stone. She was blood and heat and weight. I lay there rigid, afraid that if I moved, the mattress would shift and send me rolling into her gravity. My mind, usually racing with burn rates and user acquisition costs, went silent. There was only the awareness of her. The distance was inches, but the voltage crossing it was enough to light the city. Stop thinking so loud, she murmured into the dark, her voice thick with sleep. I'm not thinking, I whispered back. You are vibrating, she countered. Go to sleep. The structure will hold. I closed my eyes, but I didn't sleep. I just lay there, suspended in the heat, realizing that the structure she was talking about, the wall between us, was already starting to crack. I woke up to the sound of nothing. The rhythmic breathing that had lulled me into a fragile sleep was gone, and the heat that had radiated across the pillow wall had vanished, leaving the right side of the bed cold. I blinked into the darkness, my heart doing a slow, confused thud against my ribs, until my eyes adjusted to the gloom. Elena was across the room. She hadn't turned on a lamp. That would have been too aggressive, too much light for 3 a.m. Instead, she was standing by the window, using the amber bleed of the streetlights below to see. She was sketching again, using the windowsill as a desk, her body curved over the paper, in a posture that was less about work and more about desperation. She was wearing only my spare t-shirt, a faded black cotton thing that hung off her frame, and the sight of the marble saint looking so unpolished, so domestic, felt like a glitch in the simulation. I pushed back the duvet and stood up. The floorboards were freezing, grounding me instantly. I moved slowly, not wanting to startle her, but she didn't flinch. She knew I was there. She probably knew the moment my breathing pattern changed from sleep to wakefulness. The structure failed? I asked softly, stopping a few feet behind her. The mine failed, she corrected, her voice low and raspy. She didn't turn around. Her hand kept moving, the pencil scratching a frantic rhythm against the paper. I closed my eyes, and all I could see were load-bearing walls cracking. I needed to externalize the stress. I stepped closer, invading the personal space she usually guarded with such ferocity. In the daylight, in her suits, she was a fortress. Here, in the dark, with her hair loose and her shoulders hunched, she was just a woman trying to outrun her own brain. I looked over her shoulder at the sketch. It wasn't a building. It wasn't the clean, geometric lines of a museum or the sharp angles of a corporate tower. It was a mess of charcoal shadows and jagged lines, a storm captured in graphite. It looked like my apartment. It looked like us. You never told me, I said, the question rising up from somewhere deep, emboldened by the dark. Why you really gave me the key. It wasn't for safety, was it? She stopped drawing. The pencil froze mid-stroke. The silence stretched out, heavy and thick, filled only by the distant hum of a garbage truck 3 avenues over. Safety isn't about locks, she whispered. She turned then, leaning her back against the window frame, the amber light catching the hollow of her throat. She looked exhausted, stripped down to the studs. My life is perfect geometry, surely you've noticed. Everything is measured. Everything is precise. It's quiet. It's so quiet that sometimes I feel like I'm already dead and just haunting my own furniture. She looked down at her hands, stained with graphite. I gave you the key because every time I walked past your door, I heard something crashing, or you laughing, or something breaking. It sounded real. I wanted a tether. I wanted to know that if the silence got too loud, I had a key to a place where things were allowed to be messy. The admission hung in the air, fragile as glass. The marble saint hadn't come here because of a flood. She had come here because she was drowning in perfection. I took a step closer. I couldn't help it. The magnetic pull in the room had shifted again, drawing me toward her. I was close enough now to smell the sleep on her skin, warm and human beneath the sandalwood. I reached out, my hand hovering near the hand that held the pencil. I didn't touch her, but I was close enough that I could feel the heat radiating from her arm. It's messy here, I murmured, my voice dropping to a register I didn't recognize. I'm messy. I know, she breathed. Her eyes locked onto mine, dark and searching. She didn't pull away. She didn't retreat into professional distance. She leaned in, just an inch, a microscopic surrender. That's the problem. What is? You, she said. The word was a heavy exhale. I can calculate stress loads on a suspension bridge. I can predict how light will hit an atrium at the solstice, but you introduce variables I can't isolate. My hand brushed hers, just the tips of our fingers. A spark, literal and electric, jumped between us. The pencil slipped from her fingers. It hit the floor with a sharp, wooden clatter that sounded like a gunshot in the quiet room. I can't calculate, she confessed, her voice trembling slightly. It wasn't a complaint this time. It was a surrender. When you're this close, the blueprint dissolves. I can't see the lines anymore. Maybe you don't need the lines, I whispered. I leaned in. She tilted her head back, her eyes fluttering shut. The distance was gone. The air between us was superheated, charged with 3 days of shared space and 6 months of stolen glances. I was about to cross the final threshold to bridge the gap between the architect and the chaos when bzzz. My phone lying on the floor by the bed vibrated against the hardwood with the violence of a drill. The sound shattered the moment instantly. Elena flinched back as if she'd been burned, her eyes snapping open, wide and terrified. The vulnerability vanished, replaced instantly by the walls she threw back up. She grabbed her wrist, pulling her hand away from mine, stepping sideways out of the intimate circle we had created. Work, she said, the word sharp. A shield. It could be the Tokyo team. Elena, I should sleep, she interrupted, turning her back to me and moving toward the bed with a rigid, fast walk. We have to be up in 3 hours. This is inefficient. She didn't look back. She climbed into her side of the bed and pulled the duvet up to her chin. I stood by the window, my heart hammering against my ribs, staring at the pencil on the floor. The moment was gone. but the truth wasn't. She had dropped the pencil. The structure had cracked, and no amount of retreating to her side of the bed was going to fix the foundation. Now, the restoration of order didn't arrive with a fanfare or a grand declaration. It arrived with a generic ringtone at 8:14 a.m. Elena was in the kitchen, measuring water for her tea with the seriousness of a chemist, when her phone buzzed against the granite counter. She answered it on the first ring, her posture straightening instantly into that familiar, terrifying vertical line. "Yes," she said. Her voice clipped, stripped of the husky rasp it had held in the dark only 5 hours ago. She listened for 10 seconds, her eyes fixed on a crack in the plaster of my wall. "Understood. I will vacate immediately." She hung up and set the phone down. She didn't look at me. She looked at the teapot. "The structural reinforcements are complete," she announced, the words falling like stones into the quiet room. "The master suite is habitable. The contractor has cleared the site." "Oh," I said. It was a stupid small sound. I was standing by the coffee machine, wearing the same oversized t-shirt I had slept in, holding a mug that suddenly felt too heavy. "That was fast. I thought they said 3 days." "They accelerated the timeline," she said, turning off the kettle before the water even boiled. I offered a bonus for early completion. Efficiency is purchasable. She didn't wait for a response. She moved past me, the silk of her robe creating a breeze that I felt on my bare arms, and walked into the living room. The marble saint was back. The vulnerability of the 3 a.m. window session had been plastered over, sealed tight behind a facade of high-gloss professionalism. She began to pack. It was devastating to watch. There was no hesitation, no sentimental lingering over the shared space. She folded her clothes with military precision, aligning the seams before placing them into her leather bag. She rolled up her architectural drawings, snapping them into their tubes with a finality that echoed in the room. She was erasing herself from my life, object by object. The expensive shampoo disappeared from the bathroom ledge. The silver pen was plucked from the table. The specific, clean scent of her was being siphoned out of the air, replaced by the returning smell of dust and old solder. I stood in the doorway of the living room, feeling like an intruder in my own apartment. "You don't have to rush," I offered, a weak attempt to buy time. "You haven't had your tea." "I have a meeting at 11, she said, zipping the bag. She stood up, smoothing the front of her trousers. She was fully armored now. Charcoal suit, heels, hair pulled back into a severe twist. The woman who had dropped a pencil because her hand was shaking was gone. And I need to recalibrate my workspace. The light in here, it's been difficult. "Right," I said, the rejection stinging more than I expected. "The light." She walked to the door, her heels clicking on the hardwood, a sharp staccato rhythm that sounded like a countdown. She paused with her hand on the latch. For a second, just a split second, her shoulders dropped. She didn't turn around. She stared at the wood grain of the door as if reading a code. "Thank you," she said, her voice low, "for the accommodation." "Any time," I lied. "That's what neighbors are for." "Goodbye," she said. The door clicked shut. The sound, metal sliding into metal, was absolute. It was the period at the end of a sentence I hadn't finished reading. I stood there for a long time, staring at the locked door. The silence rushed back in to fill the vacuum she had left, but it wasn't the comfortable silence of before. It was heavy. It was a physical weight, pressing against my eardrums. The apartment looked exactly as it had 3 days ago, messy, cluttered, mine, but it felt completely wrong. The war room didn't feel like a place of innovation anymore. It looked like a junk drawer. I tried to work. I sat down at my desk, pulled up the prototype schematics, and stared at the screen. I typed a command. I deleted it. I picked up my soldering iron, but my hand felt clumsy. The air in the room was stagnant. Elena had called my furniture arrangement inefficient, and sitting there alone, I realized she was right. The flow was broken. I couldn't focus. The irony wasn't lost on me. She had left because she couldn't focus when we were close, and now I couldn't function because we were apart. I paced the room. I walked from the kitchen to the window, retracing the steps of our cohabitation. The ghost of her routine was everywhere. The empty space on the counter where her tea had been, the indentation on the pillow that was slowly rising back to neutral. I ended up by the window, the spot where she had stood last night. The street below was busy with the mid-morning rush, indifferent to the fact that my internal world had just collapsed. I looked down at the floor, at the gap between the floorboards where the dust motes danced in the sunlight, and that's when I saw it. She hadn't erased herself completely. Tucked against the molding, half hidden by the curtain, was a sheet of vellum. It wasn't the drawing she had been working on, the chaotic storm of charcoal lines. It was something else. I picked it up. It was a small, quick sketch, probably done in seconds. It was a drawing of me. I was asleep, my face pressed into the pillow, my arm thrown over the duvet wall. But she hadn't drawn me as a mess. She had drawn me with clean, strong lines. She had drawn me like I was the structure holding the bed together. At the bottom, in her precise, architectural handwriting, she had written a single note. Load-bearing. I held the paper, my thumb brushing the graphite, and felt the hollow ache in my chest expand. She hadn't left because she didn't care. She had left because she did. And for a woman built of marble and logic, that was the most terrifying variable of all. The evening stretched out ahead of me, vast and empty, and for the first time in my life, I was afraid of the dark. The silence in my apartment wasn't peaceful anymore. It was an accusation. It was just past midnight, and I was sitting at the kitchen island, the glow of my laptop illuminating a half-eaten bagel and a soldering iron I hadn't touched in hours. I was trying to draft a follow-up email to the investors, a simple task that should have taken 10 minutes, but the words felt hollow. The air in the room was stale, lacking that sharp ozone charge that Elena brought with her. I was alone, surrounded by the familiar clutter of my life, and for the first time in 2 years, the solitude felt less like freedom and more like a sentence. I had my space back. I had my bed back. I had total control over the thermostat and the lighting, and I hated it. Then the sound returned. It was unmistakable. The metallic slide of the spare key into the deadbolt. It wasn't the frantic, wet fumbling of 3 nights ago. This was deliberate, controlled. A slow, confident turn that echoed in the quiet hallway like a declaration of intent. I spun around on my stool, my heart hammering a frantic, erratic rhythm against my ribs. The door swung open, but this time there was no rain. No soaking wet coat, no ruined shoes, no look of desperate panic. Elena stood in the doorway. She was still wearing the charcoal suit from this morning, though the jacket was unbuttoned now, revealing the silk blouse underneath. She looked impeccable. The marble saint returned to her pedestal. Except for one thing. She was holding a bottle of wine in one hand and her rolled-up blueprints in the other. Her expression wasn't apologetic. It was determined. She didn't wait for an invitation. She stepped inside, the door clicking shut behind her with a soft, final thud. She locked it. "Did a pipe burst again?" I asked, my voice sounding rough in the quiet. "Or did the HVAC system develop a hostile hum?" "The plumbing is functioning at 100% efficiency," she said, walking past the entryway and dropping her keys into the bowl I kept for loose change. The sound was domestic, terrifyingly casual. "The climate control is precise to the decimal. The lighting is optimal. The linens are fresh." "So your apartment is perfect," I said, watching her move. She wasn't heading for the couch. She wasn't heading for the guest territory where she had spent the first night. She was walking straight toward the kitchen island, my workspace. "It is flawless," she agreed, setting the wine down next to my soldering iron with a heavy clink. "It is a masterpiece of modern design, and it is absolutely impossible to exist in." She turned to face me then, leaning her hip against the counter, invading the personal space I had just spent 12 hours trying to reclaim. Her eyes were dark, serious, stripping away the politeness she usually wore like armor. "I walked in there, and the silence was heavy," she admitted, her fingers tracing the edge of the granite. "It didn't feel like a sanctuary. It felt like a vacuum. There is no friction, no resistance, just the echo of my own ambition bouncing off the glass walls. The acoustics of success, I believe the broker called it." She let out a short, dry laugh, a sound that lacked all humor. it turns out success sounds incredibly lonely. Elena, I started, not sure what I was asking, my hand gripping the edge of the stool. I sat at my drafting table for 3 hours, she continued, ignoring me. I stared at the Tokyo plans. I tried to find the line, but all I could think about was the hum of your server in the closet, the smell of this terrible coffee, the way you pace when you're thinking. She looked at me, and the mask slipped entirely. The architectural precision melted into something rawer, something that looked terrifyingly like need. I can't build in a void, she said, her voice dropping to a whisper that carried across the narrow space between us. I thought I needed silence to focus. I was wrong. I need the chaos. I need the friction. I need to know that there is something alive in the room with me. She reached into her bag and pulled out the silver pen she had taken earlier. She placed it on top of my stack of invoices, reclaiming her spot on the island. She wasn't asking to stay. She was telling me she had returned. She wasn't a refugee from a flood anymore. She was a permanent resident of the mess we had made. You left your layout unbalanced, she said softly, her gaze holding mine, and I cannot sleep knowing the structural integrity of this room is compromised. So you came back to fix the furniture? I asked, the hope rising in my chest like a tide. No, she said, moving past me to unroll her blueprints, her shoulder brushing mine, a deliberate electric contact. I came back because I work better in your chaos than I do in my perfection. She didn't stay on her side of the island. That was the first rule to break. She walked around the granite slab, invading the small, protected square of floor space I claimed as my cockpit. She stood directly in front of me, close enough that the fabric of her trousers brushed against my knees. The smell of rain and expensive perfume was overwhelming now, a sensory tide rising to drown out the smell of solder. I looked up at her. The marble saint was looking down at me, but the facade had finally cracked. Her hand reached out, not to fix a collar or straighten a stack of papers, but to land heavy and possessive on my shoulder. Her thumb pressed into the junction of my neck, finding the pulse that was hammering there. It was a grounding wire, connecting her high-voltage precision to my erratic current. I still can't focus, she whispered, the words dropping into the space between us like weights. I thought you said the chaos helped, I managed, my voice barely a thread. I thought you needed the noise. It's not the chaos, she corrected, her eyes tracking the movement of my throat. It's the proximity. When you're this close, the logic fails. The variables refuse to settle. I look at the paper, and I just see the space where you should be. So move back, I challenged, though I leaned into her touch, my hands gripping the edge of the stool to keep from shaking. Retreat to the safe zone. No, she said, her fingers tightening on my shoulder. I'm done retreating. I'm changing the design. She leaned down. It wasn't a question. It wasn't a tentative exploration of boundaries. It was a decision. Her mouth found mine with the same terrifying precision she used to draft skylines. It was exact, inevitable, and devastating. It tasted like wine and relief. It felt like a final design element clicking into place, the keystone that stops the arch from collapsing. I didn't pull away. I pulled her in. My hands found the silk of her blouse, the sharp line of her waist, pulling her out of the abstract and into the tangible. The blueprint tubes hit the floor with a hollow clatter, ignored. The wine bottle was forgotten. The only thing that existed was the sudden, overwhelming, structural integrity of us. We didn't get any work done that night. The Tokyo project sat rolled up on the floor. My prototype remained unsoiled. We ended up sitting on the floor of my living room, leaning against the lumpy couch she hated, her legs tangled with mine, a mess of expensive wool and worn denim. The silence wasn't heavy anymore. It was shared. This is inefficient, she murmured against my neck, her hand tracing the line of my jaw as if memorizing a new floor plan. It's terrible for productivity, I agreed, resting my head on her shoulder, feeling the steady rhythm of her breathing. I know, she sighed, sounding perfectly content. We'll have to schedule around it. I'll need to allocate significant hours for maintenance. We were building something new. It wasn't a museum of silence, and it wasn't a warehouse of panic. It was a structure that could hold both the marble and the mess. It was a foundation that wouldn't crack under the weight of two women who had finally stopped running from the quiet. The spare key sits on the kitchen counter now, gathering dust next to the fruit bowl. It doesn't need to be hidden. The door is usually unlocked. On the island, 2 cups sit side by side, my chipped ceramic mug and her porcelain teacup. They don't match, but they fit. If you understand the pull of a gravity you can't explain, subscribe for more stories about the risks we take.